I never imagined a simple knock on the door could shatter my world. But there he was, standing in my living room with a toolbox and a smile that made my pulse race. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. He was just fixing the sink, or so I thought. But as he leaned closer, our eyes locked, and suddenly I knew nothing would ever be the same again. I always thought my marriage was stable, comfortable, even. John and I had been together for 12 years. We weren't the perfect couple, but we had built a life that felt secure. Or so I told myself. The truth was harder to face. Somewhere between paying bills and managing schedules, we had lost the spark that once made us inseparable. John worked long hours, often coming home too tired to talk, let alone notice me. Our conversations had dwindled to discussions about groceries and home repairs. I missed the way he used to look at me, like I was the most beautiful woman in the world. Now I felt invisible. Still, I kept up appearances, cooking dinners, tidying up the house, pretending everything was fine. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the growing emptiness. It lingered during quiet nights when John fell asleep on the couch, leaving me awake and scrolling through my phone just to feel connected to something, anything. And then Mark showed up. It started with a broken door hinge, a minor repair that John said he'd handle but never did. So I called someone from the local handyman service. I wasn't expecting much, just someone to fix the door and leave. But when Mark walked in, everything shifted. He wasn't what I expected. Tall, with broad shoulders and a quiet confidence, he seemed at ease, like he belonged wherever he went. His eyes were warm and kind, and when he smiled, it felt genuine, like he actually saw me. I showed him around the house, pointing out the small things that needed fixing. He listened, really listened, nodding as I spoke and asking thoughtful questions. For the first time in years, I felt heard. After he finished, he complimented the house, saying it had character. It was a simple comment, but the way he said it, like he was talking about me instead, left my heart pounding. I told myself it was nothing, just harmless admiration. But as he packed up his tools and turned back to smile one last time before leaving, something inside me stirred. I didn't know it then, but that moment would change everything. The days after Mark's first visit felt different. I told myself it was silly, just a brief moment of attention from a stranger, but I couldn't stop thinking about him. His voice lingered in my mind, and the way his eyes held mine replayed like a scene from a movie I couldn't turn off. John didn't notice. He never did. He came home late, distracted as always, barely glancing up from his laptop. I sat across from him at the dinner table, but my thoughts were elsewhere. Mark had fixed the door hinge, yet I found myself hoping something else would break. Anything that would give me a reason to call him again. And then it happened. 2 weeks later, the bathroom faucet started leaking. It wasn't an emergency, but I didn't hesitate. My fingers hovered over Mark's number before I hit dial. "Back so soon?" he teased when he answered. I laughed, but the sound felt hollow. "What can I say? This house keeps me busy. For you." "Always," he said, his voice smooth and easy. By the time he arrived, I was already nervous. I'd spent too long picking out an outfit that looked casual but flattering. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just a repair job. Nothing more. But when he walked in, that same calm confidence filled the room, and I felt it again, the pull I couldn't explain. Mark got to work, and I stayed nearby, pretending I was cleaning but really just finding excuses to talk to him. The conversation flowed effortlessly. We talked about his childhood, growing up on a farm, and how he'd always liked working with his hands. I told him about my love for writing, something I hadn't done in years. "You should start again," he said, pausing to look at me. "You talk about it like it's still a part of you." His words struck something deep, and I felt the heat rise to my cheeks. I knew I should walk away, leave him to finish his work, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed, drawn to him in a way that felt dangerous. And then, as he reached to tighten a pipe, his arm brushed against mine. It was the lightest touch, but it sent a jolt through me. I told myself it was an accident, but the way he looked at me afterward told me otherwise. He didn't move away. Neither did I. The tension in the room thickened. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. I nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired." But we both knew it was more than that. When he finished, he lingered by the door. "If anything else needs fixing," he said, "you know where to find me." I did, and that terrified me. Over the next few days, I told myself to forget it, to forget him. But the more I tried, the more I replayed the way he looked at me, the way his voice softened when he asked about my writing. It wasn't just attraction. It was the way he made me feel, seen, understood, alive. And as much as I tried to ignore it, I knew it was only a matter of time before I'd find another excuse to call him again. I told myself I wouldn't call him again. I told myself what happened was just a moment, a fleeting rush of emotions caused by loneliness. But that didn't stop me from looking at the faucet he fixed or replaying his words in my head. So when the dining room light started flickering a week later, I didn't even hesitate. I dialed his number. "This one should be easy," Mark said when he arrived, toolbox in hand. His smile was easy and warm, and it hit me harder than it should have. I tried to keep my distance this time, lingering in the kitchen while he worked, but even from across the room, I couldn't stop watching him. The way his shirt stretched across his shoulders, the faint scent of sawdust and cologne that seemed to fill the air, it all felt too intimate. "You're quiet today," he said, breaking the silence. "Just tired," I lied, though my racing pulse said otherwise. He stepped down from the ladder and turned to face me. "You sure that's all?" The way he looked at me, steady, unflinching, made it impossible to lie. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. His brow furrowed, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The air between us felt heavier than it should have, charged with something neither of us dared to name. Mark stepped closer. "I should have moved away, but I didn't. Sometimes," he said, his voice low and careful, "you can feel it, like something's missing. And you don't even realize how much you needed it until it's right in front of you." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "Mark." He didn't let me finish. Instead, he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. The touch was light, almost innocent, but it sent a shiver through me. I should have stepped back. I should have said something to stop this. But instead, I closed my eyes, leaning into his touch just enough to feel his warmth. "This is wrong," I whispered. "Then tell me to leave," he said. But I didn't. I opened my eyes, and when our gazes locked, something shifted. He leaned in, his breath warm against my skin. My body tensed, torn between fear and desire. And then it happened. His lips brushed against mine, soft, hesitant, as if he was giving me one last chance to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I kissed him back, letting the weight of my loneliness and longing crash over me. It was brief, just a moment before reality slammed back into focus. I pulled away, my breath shaky. "I can't," I said, stepping back. Mark's eyes softened, but he didn't try to stop me. "I'm sorry," I added, my voice trembling. "Don't be," he said quietly. "I'll go." And just like that, he was gone, leaving me standing in the middle of my living room, my lips still tingling and my heart aching with something I couldn't even name. But it wasn't over. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about him. I told myself it was just a mistake, that it wouldn't happen again. But then I saw him working on a neighbor's porch. I tried to walk past without looking, but he saw me. "You okay?" he called out. I should have ignored him, but instead I nodded and walked over. "I'm fine," I said, but the way he looked at me told me he didn't believe it. "You don't have to pretend," he said, his voice softer now. "Not with me." And that's when I knew I wasn't strong enough to stay away. Over the next few weeks, Mark kept finding reasons to stop by. A loose cabinet hinge, a faulty outlet, small repairs that never seemed urgent but always gave him an excuse to linger. And I let him. We talked, sometimes about nothing, sometimes about everything. He told me about his failed marriage, how it fell apart when he and his wife stopped paying attention to each other. "It's easy to lose something when you don't take care of it," he said, his eyes locked on mine. I knew he wasn't just talking about his marriage. I shared things too, about how John and I had drifted, how I felt invisible even when we were in the same room. Mark listened, really listened, and for the first time in years I felt like someone saw me. And that scared me, because no matter how much I tried to fight it, the feelings were already there, growing stronger every time we were together. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before I'd let myself fall completely. The storm outside was relentless, rain hammering against the windows as thunder rumbled in the distance. I sat on the sofa, staring blankly at my phone, trying to drown out the noise both outside and inside my head. I shouldn't have called him. I knew at the moment I hit dial, but when he answered, I couldn't stop myself. "I think the outlet in the living room is acting up again," I'd said, my voice trembling. "I'll be there in 20, Mark replied without hesitation. And now he was here. He stood by the door, droplets of rain clinging to his jacket, his hair damp from the downpour. His eyes found mine, and I knew this wasn't just another repair job. "Rough night?" he asked softly, setting down his toolbox. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. Mark moved closer, his presence filling the room in a way that both comforted and terrified me. He knelt by the outlet, pulling out his tools, but his focus wasn't on the repair, it was on me. "You seem different," he said, glancing up. I tried to brush it off. "It's nothing. Just tired." But he didn't buy it. "You sure?" I opened my mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, my eyes betrayed me, darting toward him and lingering for just a moment too long. He noticed. Mark stood slowly, his gaze locked on mine. "You don't have to do this alone, you know." My breath caught in my throat. He stepped closer. "I see you. And I think you know that." I should have said something, anything to break the tension, but I didn't. Instead, I let him close the distance, let him reach out and brush his fingers against my cheek. "You're shaking," he whispered. "I can't," I started, but even I didn't believe it. "Yes, you can." And then his lips were on mine, warm, insistent, and everything I'd been craving. I didn't stop him. I couldn't. My hands tangled in his shirt, pulling him closer as the rain battered the windows, drowning out every thought of guilt and consequence. But then, just as quickly as it started, it fell apart. A sharp knock echoed through the room. We froze. I pulled away, my heart pounding as Mark stepped back, his chest heaving. "Who is it?" he asked, his voice low. I didn't have to check to know. It was John. Panic surged through me. "You have to go," I whispered. Mark hesitated. "Are you sure?" "Yes," I hissed, pushing him toward the back door. He grabbed his tools, but before leaving, he turned back to look at me. "This isn't over." And then he was gone. I barely had time to compose myself before John stepped inside, his eyes immediately scanning the room. "You okay?" he asked, frowning. I forced a smile. "Yeah, just cleaning up." But he didn't look convinced. His eyes drifted toward the outlet, the one Mark had been working on. "Was someone here?" My heart stopped. "No." "Why?" "There's a rag on the floor," he said, bending down to pick it up. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling. "Oh, that's probably from earlier. I was cleaning the baseboards." He nodded slowly, but his eyes lingered on me a little too long, and I knew I hadn't fooled him. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mark, his hands, his eyes, his words echoing in my mind. This isn't over. And he was right. The next morning, I found myself staring at my phone, his number glowing on the screen. I wanted to delete it, to erase the temptation entirely, but I couldn't. Instead, I sent a text. "We need to talk." The reply came almost instantly. "Name the time and place." We met at a coffee shop, away from prying eyes. I told myself I was there to end things, to put this whole mess behind me. But when I saw him, all my resolve crumbled. "I can't keep doing this," I said, but my voice shook. Mark leaned closer, his eyes filled with something I couldn't name. "Then stop pretending you don't want this." I looked away, but he gently tilted my chin back toward him. "You deserve to be happy," he said softly. Tears welled in my eyes. "I don't even know what happy feels like anymore." "Let me show you," he whispered. And just like that, the walls I'd built came crashing down. I don't remember how long we sat there, but by the time we left, I knew things would never be the same. I went home that night filled with guilt and longing, torn between the life I had and the life I wanted. John noticed the change. He asked if I was okay, and I lied again. But this time, I saw the doubt in his eyes. Days passed, and the tension grew unbearable. The guilt was eating me alive, but so was the desire. It all came to a head one evening when John came home earlier than I expected. Mark was there. We were in the kitchen, too close, our voices hushed. When John walked in, his eyes immediately went to us. He didn't say a word, but the look on his face said it all. Mark stepped back, guilt flashing across his face. "Who is this?" John asked, his voice sharp. "Just the handyman," I replied, but the words felt hollow. John didn't believe me. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands curled into fists. "Get out," he said, his voice dangerously calm. Mark looked at me one last time before leaving, but the damage was done. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. The silence that followed Mark's departure was deafening. John stood in the middle of the kitchen, his eyes fixed on me like I was a stranger, someone he no longer recognized. "Who is he, really?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, sharp enough to cut through the air. "He's just the handyman," I whispered, but even as I said it, the words felt empty. John's eyes narrowed. "Don't lie to me." I wanted to deny it, to insist nothing had happened, but the truth was written all over my face. My trembling hands, my flushed cheeks, I couldn't hide it. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Sorry," he snapped, his voice breaking. "That's it?" You're sorry. Tears welled in my eyes, but he didn't give me a chance to speak. How long has this been going on? It's not what you think, I stammered, but he wasn't listening. He grabbed his keys from the counter, his movements quick and tense. Where are you going? I asked, panic rising in my chest. I need to think, he said, and before I could stop him, he was gone. The front door slammed, leaving me alone in the emptiest house I had ever known. I sank to the floor, tears spilling down my cheeks as the weight of my actions came crashing down. I had destroyed everything. The life we built, the trust we shared, it was all gone in a single moment. Days passed and John didn't come home. I tried calling, but he wouldn't answer. My messages went unread, and the silence grew heavier with each passing hour. Mark called too, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. The thought of hearing his voice filled me with equal parts longing and guilt. I spent my nights replaying everything in my head, the lingering touches, the stolen glances, the kiss that started it all. And no matter how much I tried to justify it, I knew there was no excuse. When John finally returned, he looked like a different man, cold, distant, and guarded. Do you love him? He asked, his voice hollow. No, I said quickly, shaking my head. It wasn't love. It was, I don't know what it was. He nodded slowly, but his eyes didn't soften. I can't do this anymore. Those words shattered me. John, please. We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes. But he didn't believe me. And maybe he shouldn't have. He packed a bag that night. I need space, he said, his voice breaking just enough to let me know he still cared, just not enough to stay. I didn't stop him. I couldn't. After he left, the house felt more like a prison than a home. Everywhere I turned, there were reminders of what I had lost. His toothbrush in the bathroom, his favorite mug in the kitchen, the imprint of his body on the side of the bed. I tried to distract myself, cleaning, rearranging furniture, anything to keep my mind from spiraling. But no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the ache in my chest. Mark reached out a few times, leaving voicemails asking if I was okay, but I never responded. I couldn't face him, not after everything that had happened. The guilt was suffocating. I didn't just hurt John, I hurt myself. I wanted to blame Mark, to say he lured me into something I never wanted, but the truth was, I let it happen. I let myself fall into the fantasy because it was easier than facing the reality of my failing marriage. But fantasies don't last. The weeks dragged on, and John didn't come back. He sent a few emails about splitting bills and picking up some of his things, but there was no mention of reconciliation. And as much as it hurt, I knew he was right to keep his distance. What we had wasn't perfect, but it deserved more than what I gave it. One afternoon, Mark showed up unexpectedly. I just wanted to make sure you're okay, he said, standing in the doorway like he wasn't sure if he should come in. I wanted to tell him I was fine, that I didn't need him anymore, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I let him in. We talked for hours, about guilt, regret, and all the ways we'd both messed up. When he left, I felt lighter somehow, like I'd finally started to let go of the shame that had been suffocating me. But it didn't change what I'd done. John didn't come back, and Mark didn't stay. I was alone, and for the first time in my life, I had to figure out who I was without someone else to define me. And maybe that was the punishment I deserved. The days turned into weeks, and the silence in the house became deafening. The echoes of my choices lingered in every corner, forcing me to face what I had done, not just to John, but to myself. I had shattered the foundation of my marriage, but the cracks had been there long before Mark entered the picture. I just didn't want to see them. I spent countless nights replaying every moment, every word, and every touch. I wanted to convince myself that it wasn't all my fault, that John's neglect had pushed me toward Mark. But deep down, I knew the truth. I made the choice. I let the loneliness take over. I let the attention Mark gave me feel more important than the vows I had made. And now I had to live with that. John's absence didn't just leave an empty space in the house. It left an emptiness in me that no amount of cleaning or distractions could fill. I tried to reach out, but his replies were short, distant. It was over, and I had to accept that. One evening, as I sat alone on the sofa, I thought about Mark. I thought about how easy it was to let myself fall for someone who made me feel seen, but also how dangerous it was to confuse attention with love. What I felt for Mark wasn't love, it was escape. And that realization hit me harder than anything else. For so long, I had been running from my unhappiness, my insecurities, and my fear of being invisible. Mark wasn't the cause of my downfall, he was just the symptom of something deeper. I had been unhappy long before he showed up, but instead of addressing it, I let it fester. I let it grow into something that tore my marriage apart. I didn't reach out to Mark again. Not because I hated him, but because I finally understood that he was never the answer. He was just a reminder of everything I was missing, a mirror reflecting my own emptiness. I started therapy a few weeks later. It wasn't easy. Facing the truth never is. But for the first time, I felt like I was taking control of my life instead of letting it slip away. I also started writing again. Mark had been right about one thing. Writing was still a part of me. And as I poured my thoughts onto paper, I began to make sense of the chaos inside me. The words didn't fix everything, but they helped. They reminded me of who I used to be before I let life wear me down. And slowly, I started to heal. John and I spoke a few times after that. There were no screaming matches or bitter accusations, just quiet conversations filled with sadness and regret. He told me he wasn't ready to forgive me. I told him I understood. And then we said goodbye. It wasn't the ending I wanted, but maybe it was the one we needed. Because some things can't be fixed. Some things are meant to fall apart, so we can rebuild ourselves into something stronger. As I sat on the sofa that night, staring at the empty space where Mark once stood and the photos of John that no longer felt like memories but reminders of what I lost, I made a promise to myself. I would stop looking for someone else to fill the void. I would stop blaming others for my choices. And I would stop letting loneliness control my life. Because love, real love, doesn't come from fleeting moments of passion or stolen glances. It comes from the quiet, steady effort of two people who refuse to give up on each other. And if I ever found that again, I wouldn't let it slip away. What would you do if you were in her position? Could you forgive the betrayal? Or would you walk away forever? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more gripping stories that dive deep into love, loss, and temptation. You won't believe what's coming next.